Hello, everyone. Um, I see that people are still filtering in, so we'll give them another minute or so before we start with today's seminar. In the meantime, I would like to ask that everyone please keep their microphones muted and the cameras off for the duration of the seminar. And then maybe as we get ready to start, maybe you can, in the chat, just indicate where you are tuning in from around the world. It's always interesting to see who we reach with these seminars. Please also note that the seminar is being recorded and it will be available on the SCB Vimeo channel in a day or so. And then I would like to welcome you to what is the 14th seminar of 2021 in the Society for Conservation Biology's Emerging Issues in Conservation seminar series. In the series, we feature articles selected by the editors that are recently accepted in early online view or recently published in the 3 SCB journals, those being Conservation Biology, Conservation Letters, and of course, Conservation Science and Practice. Now, my name is Martin Strauss, and I will be hosting today's seminar. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Environmental Science at the University of South Africa, and I'm also an associate editor at Conservation Science and Practice, and have been organizing the seminar series during 2021. So it is my great pleasure to introduce you today to Tom Pienkowski, our speaker for today. Now, over the last 10 years, Tom has worked in both conservation science and practice, including in Central America and East Africa. He's currently a PhD researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for Conservation Science at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on links between ecological change and human health and understanding conservationists' experiences in the sector, particularly around their well-being at work. Now, Tom will be speaking to us for about half an hour or so, whereafter there will be time for questions and discussion. Now, you're welcome to post your questions in the chat while he's busy, or comments in the chat while he's busy. Or if you prefer, you can ask your questions live at the end of the presentation when invited to do so. Then you can unmute yourself and ask your question in person. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Tom, and we'll speak again at the end of your seminar. Thanks, Tom.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you very much for the introductions, Martin, and thank you to everyone for joining. My name is Tom Pienkowski, as Martin says. I'm in the final year of my PhD at the Interdisciplinary Center for Conservation Science at the University of Oxford. My current research has actually gone in kind of a little bit of a different direction from what I'm going to be talking about today. My PhD research at the moment is actually exploring links between conservation and mental health. And this includes one part of the PhD, which is looking at ways in which conserved landscapes and conservation management influences people's mental health. And I'm exploring that through a case study in rural Uganda. And then the kind of second part of my PhD, which is looking at mental health and well-being within the conservation community itself. So I don't know if some of you might have seen the Life in Conservation survey, which was going around a couple of years ago, or about a year or so ago. So that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the research I did whilst working with Roman Carrasco in collaboration with Mega Werner at the National University of Singapore and Carly Cook at Monash University. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the topic of cost effectiveness in conservation. And although I say it's not my kind of current area of research, I think that this project has brought about a kind of a bit of a perspective on how I perhaps think about conservation science in practice in general and in my own work. So for instance, thinking about the types of research topics that I might choose to pursue, kind of asking myself if I believe the effectiveness or the impact of the research is actually worth the cost in terms of kind of time and effort. And I think in this context, by impact, I don't necessarily mean academic impact. I mean more in terms of hoping to be of value to those groups to which I hold myself accountable. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a sense of my motivations and where I'm coming from. As Martin says, I'm going to be talking for about 25-30 minutes. I'm just going to start off by providing a quick kind of overview of what we'll cover. We'll start by talking a bit about what we mean by cost effectiveness in conservation. And then we'll talk a little bit about perhaps the kind of history of cost effectiveness in conservation science. And then within this, identifying or a kind of potential implementation gap around the adoption of cost effectiveness based prioritization in conservation. And then we'll look at some of the questions and results that we explored in this study. And then I'll be talking a bit about what I think might be some kind of possible approaches for overcoming this implementation gap, and how cost effectiveness analysis could be integrated into other areas of conservation science potentially. So what do we mean by cost effectiveness in the context of conservation? I understand it as kind of simply the ratio of costs on one hand and some kind of standardized desired unit of conservation outcome on the other hand. So I'm going to go through the example which we actually included in the article, which will hopefully kind of illustrate this point a little bit better. So I want you to imagine that you're a conservation manager. I suspect some of you might actually be conservation managers. And I want you to imagine you've got 100 quid to spare, so you don't have very much money. And you have these 3 candidate interventions for recovering a species from, say, 0% of its population to 100% of its population. So you've got those 3 interventions, A, B, and C. And you could choose the most effective option, which is A, where you'd spend the full £100 and you'd get a kind of 50% effectiveness or a kind of 50% recovery of your imaginary population. And as we said before, this is the most effective intervention, but it doesn't necessarily represent the best conservation outcome that we can get with the budget that we have. So instead, investing your money in interventions B and C, each of which you'll see from the table are less effective than A, would mean you actually end up with a kind of total effectiveness of 60%. So that's because the cost for both interventions B and C are substantially less than for A. And so you can easily imagine real life situations where ignoring costs mean that we don't actually necessarily get the kind of biggest bang for the conservation buck that we have. And actually, as we'll talk about in a kind of a moment or so, even the idea of basing conservation decision making on effectiveness, that's something which is still in quite a kind of latent stage, in that I think a lot of kind of conservation decision making at the moment isn't really based on evidence of effectiveness. A lot of it is actually more based on kind of heuristic processes, which have value, and that's something which we'll also talk about as well. And so why should we care about this topic? I think it's pretty obvious to everyone that conservation doesn't have the resources that it needs to achieve its aims. So for an example, in 2019, the US Fish and Wildlife Services had about half the funds that it actually needed to achieve its core conservation objectives. Similarly, there's a paper which was published in 2012 that basically estimated that the global conservation funding would need to be about an order of magnitude higher to be able to actually meet these kind of global conservation targets. And obviously conservationists have been calling for more funding, and they've also been kind of looking for novel ways of raising money for conservation, like payment for ecosystem services and stuff like that. But in the meantime, we're still failing to meet those key conservation targets. None of the 2020 Aichi biodiversity targets were fully met, for example. So in that meantime, many have argued that we need to prioritize conservation interventions that are most cost effective. And so you can see from this top quote from Andrew Barnford, this is something which has been known for decades. And so in this respect, we're not necessarily saying anything new. And just thinking back to that previous slide when we were talking about the ratio of costs on one hand and effectiveness on the other. Actually, there's been real gains in understanding effectiveness. So for instance, what works in conservation is the title of this fantastic annual publication, which is produced by the Conservation Evidence Initiative, which is led by Bill Sutherland and others. And that maintains, I think last time I checked, that maintained this really impressive, like 6,700 summaries of the effectiveness of conservation interventions. So kind of a really impressive database and resource that they've got. But as we said before, by only selecting interventions based on their effectiveness, we might not necessarily be getting the best conservation outcomes from resources that we have. That's what we saw in that kind of hypothetical table in the previous slides. And so I suppose the question becomes, given the potential benefits offered by cost effectiveness based prioritization, why isn't it a more routine part of decision making in conservation? And when we were kind of conceptualizing this project, we thought that perhaps one of the reasons might be to do with the availability, or perhaps even the unavailability and distribution of cost effectiveness evidence, in which conservation organizations could actually base their prioritization. So what did we ask? So our study actually had quite a few different aims, but I think they could simply be boiled down to asking how many conservation cost effectiveness studies are there, and what types of interventions did they look at, and where were they done? So what did we do? We reviewed the peer-reviewed literature following steps informed by the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, or PRISMA protocol. So, I mean, the PRISMA protocol is not that commonly used in conservation, I don't think, but it's much more commonly used in other disciplines like the medical sciences. And the scope of the review was all peer-reviewed studies of the cost effectiveness of nature conservation interventions globally. So here are just a couple of examples that are on the screen of the types of studies that we were looking for. And we had a bunch of inclusion criteria, and I think perhaps the most important to mention are that we excluded grey literature. That's something which I'm actually going to come back to and talk about a little bit later, what the implications of excluding grey literature might have been. And we also only included studies based on direct empirical data. So there was a lot of spatial prioritization studies, which we basically excluded because a lot of them aren't really based on that kind of direct estimates of the actual cost and effectiveness of a given intervention. And so after doing a kind of ad hoc review of the literature, we developed these 10 candidate search strings, and we trialed those and found the one which we believed to return the kind of highest proportion of relevant articles, which also included a set of predefined articles that we need to be relevant. So we had kind of 10, or I think it's either 10 or 13 articles which we knew were really relevant, and we just needed to make sure that those were represented within the final results, within the returned articles. And then we applied that search string in Web of Science, Scopus, EconLit, PubMed. And then those returned articles went through 3 stages of screening. So starting by reading through the kind of just looking at the titles, and then going through the abstracts, and then going through actually like reading the full text. And then they did the kind of final stage of data extraction. And this included extracting things like data on things like the study year, the location, the habitat type, the type of intervention. And so as you can see, out of the 13,000 odd articles or records that we identified, 91 were actually included in our review. So going back to those research questions, how many studies did we find? So as I just said, we found those 91 studies that met all of our inclusion criteria. And many of those studies actually contain more than one intervention. So bear that in mind when you see the following results. And so you can see from this figure that, there doesn't indeed appear to be a kind of growth in the number of studies over the last kind of 2 decades or so. But nevertheless, the kind of absolute number, to my mind, still appears to be relatively low. And what types of interventions did we find? So among those 91 studies, they reported on 117 different interventions across 12 intervention types. And those intervention types are based on their standard lexicon for conservation actions that was developed by Salafsky et al. In 2008. And you can see that while there are many studies related to things like invasive species control and habitat restoration, there's comparatively few studies examining many other kind of common conservation interventions. And we kind of speculated that this is perhaps because it's, I don't want to say easy, but it's relatively easier to attribute a kind of direct conservation intervention to an outcome which is perhaps like area-based or population-based, like a lot of habitat restoration and invasive species control interventions. But then that attribution might become increasingly challenging when you have these complex theories of change, such as you imagine kind of doing this attribution if you're linking awareness in the context of awareness raising campaigns, changing human behavior, and that human behavior then having implications for changes in species abundance, for instance. And so where were these studies done? So we've got the panel there, which is shown on the left, which shows the total number of observations within each country, and then the panel on the right, which is the richness of mammals, amphibians, and birds species, and that's from a study by Jenkins et al. 2013. And so, I mean, I guess a couple of things that you can see here. There's obviously this kind of strong spatial clustering around kind of North America and Australia, as perhaps we might anticipate. But then you can also see that there are vast swathes of the world where there are no studies at all, and in particular in some of the most biodiverse regions. So, I mean, in summary, in absolute terms, as we said before, I think that there are relatively few studies, and particularly from many common conservation interventions and in many of the world's most biodiverse places. And I think kind of clearly to me, this empirical evidence base isn't sufficient for cost effectiveness conservation prioritizations. And so actually we had a little bit of a kind of discussion with the reviewers about, okay, so what would the threshold for a kind of sufficiently well-developed evidence base actually look like? And I suppose one way of thinking about this is kind of thinking of it from a kind of statistical perspective, where you might want to have multiple replicates of a given intervention type in similar regions or habitats. And I think kind of looking at some of that map before and looking at some of those other figures, I think clearly we're not at that point. So why is there so little empirical evidence, or why might there be so little empirical evidence? I think first of all, this kind of reflects perhaps a feature of our methods, something which I mentioned before, that we only looked at the kind of published rather than the grey literature. But we did this because of the kind of, I suppose, well-known challenges in systematically and kind of comprehensively reviewing grey literature. And I think the kind of crucial thing here is that, if it's not accessible for us as researchers, then it's not likely to be accessible for kind of conservation organizations that might actually be taking this. So I think the kind of, beyond the context of just this study, the difficulties of accessing relevant cost effectiveness material in the grey literature is obviously a kind of wider problem. I think second, another reason is that perhaps there is a kind of limited incentive to publish such work. the drive to publish novel theoretical insights might mean that those kind of rigorous replication of cost effectiveness studies don't necessarily interest conservation scientists, or at least, not to the extent that is reflective of the value that those kind of studies have for conservation. And I think finally, and perhaps most importantly, reporting on costs might actually be quite challenging. So these costs include things like labor, capital assets, consumables, overheads, all of which are spread over different organizational levels, different time horizons, multiple different projects. And something else which was unclear or kind of remained unclear to me is, how would you go about integrating social co-benefits and social costs into these types of estimates as well? And I think this last point raises another issue. How do you go about comparing effectiveness across different types of conservation outcomes? So I think it's quite easy to compare interventions when the outcome is the same, such as if you were clearing some kind of invasive rhododendron, for instance. But what about weighing up the value of reducing elephant poaching on one hand, and then restoring seagrass habitat on the other hand? So in this kind of instance, we're comparing apples and oranges. And so how might these challenges be overcome, or how might this gap be overcome? I think that some of these challenges actually exist for many conservation prioritization efforts. So for instance, this challenge of comparing apples and oranges that we just mentioned also exists for effectiveness-based prioritization projects. And I think this highlights the fact that conservation prioritization is part of a kind of a wider process where decision makers and affected groups should, really explicitly discuss their values and priorities. And I kind of feel like this need for dialogue about values and priorities is something that's missing in many decision science approaches, which is, I guess, part of the reason why, there are a lot of kind of spatial prioritization studies, for instance, that don't necessarily influence policy. And another challenge that we mentioned before is that kind of systematic reporting of costs. And recognizing this, Lacona et al. In 2018, they actually developed this standardized reporting tool for reporting on the costs of conservation interventions. And it basically helps users report on different types of costs, such as labor, at different organizational levels in a kind of transparent and systematic way. And in fact, I think it's actually conservation biology now requires studies that report on interventions to actually use this tool. And this is something which I think in theory could be integrated into conservation organizations, grant applications and their accountancy practices. So you can imagine a situation where funders actually ask applicants to be explicit about the breakdown of costs following this framework when making applications, and then also doing the kind of project reporting afterwards. And in theory, many organizations should be attributing costs to different projects as a kind of standard part of their accountancy practices. Obviously doing this well, within organizations should help organizations monitor the cost effectiveness of their activities, even if this information isn't necessarily reported. But at the same time, if this data is being collected, then why not try and kind of link it up and report it probably anonymously into some kind of collected database. So perhaps extending something like the conservation evidence database that I mentioned before to also include cost data as well. But at the same time, recognizing that organizations of different sizes and in different parts of the world might have different capacities to do this. So I think that kind of reporting requirements would need to be sensible and sensitive to that. And so, what might the future look like for kind of cost effectiveness based prioritization in conservation? So far, we've largely been talking about kind of cost effectiveness by based prioritization at a site or a project level. But actually, I think having a well-developed evidence base would tie into a lot of other cool, interesting strands of conservation, which are coming up at the moment. So for example, such an evidence base could be combined with a mitigation and conservation hierarchy, for example, where users could choose interventions that deliver no net loss or even net gain at the lowest cost. And I guess that's kind of like a least cost, no net loss. And you could even imagine a kind of database that we just talked about actually being almost like a commercial enterprise, where companies could pay to access this data to help them save costs whilst also raising money for conservation. It could also be used to understand the kind of costs of reaching wider conservation goals. For instance, the IUCN green status of species is being used to track species recovery, and combined with cost data from ensembles of conservation interventions, we might get a better sense of how much it costs to actually recover a species over the long term, for instance. And there's also, parallels as well with the kind of green list of protected areas. And beyond that, I think having this type of cost data can probably also help flag those kind of critically underfunded habitats and locations, helping funders to decide where to direct their money at a global scale. So I think, there's still a lot of hurdles to overcome in terms of adopting cost effectiveness-based prioritization. And as I said before, this is something which people have been talking about for decades. But I think that there are recent developments, such as that standardized reporting tool that I mentioned, that make me kind of optimistic about this. I think, as we've said, kind of a well-developed evidence base, obviously, it can help us get that biggest bang for our buck. But beyond that, I think this evidence base could also help in attracting more funding. Such evidence could make it clearer what the returns on investing in nature could be. So I think kind of cost effectiveness-based prioritization is going to be increasingly important as biodiversity is mainstreamed into I guess societal decision making more broadly, as we try and kind of bend the curve on biodiversity loss. I think you can see some selected references up on the screen, and I just want to say thank you to everyone for listening. Also, just wanted to flag that again, this is obviously this project was a collective effort across all of my co-authors. I'll share a link to the study in the chat. Yeah, I'd be really pleased to hear any kind of questions or comments. They don't necessarily have to be questions. I'll just be really interested to hear what people think.
Thank you very much, Tom, for an interesting presentation. There are a couple of things in the chat, but maybe before I go there, is there anybody who's got a burning question that they'd like to ask in person? You're welcome to unmute yourself. You can switch your camera on and ask Tom directly. Maybe while people get their thoughts together. The first one that came through was from Claudia Schöner in Germany. And Claudia wanted to know, what's the time frame during which the effectiveness of the interventions were observed and analyzed? I think is.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the time frame, I mean, I think that in terms of the duration of the interventions themselves or the studies themselves, I think they range from things like, interventions which are just spread over a couple of months to ones which are over a couple of years in the cost of, in the case of things like restoration and invasive species control. I think we also looked at how long it took for studies to be published, and I can't remember that figure off the top of my head, but it's there in the paper. I can share the paper so people have it handy to look at. I don't know if that answers your question, Claudia.
Maybe I can just talk. Hi, Thanks very much, Thomas. Really interesting aspect. I was also wondering, I mean, you might have a project that's really effective and efficient, but if you go back to it a year later, then it looks as it did before the project started. Did you take that into account?
Yeah, so this is absolutely, I fully agree. And so that's not something we looked at in this study. So what we were aiming to do here was more getting a grasp on, you know, really basic information about just how many studies there were and things like that. And I think that the kind of next question is, or a really important question is, okay, what is the kind of cumulative conservation impact of these types of interventions? And I think that you're absolutely right. And there is an issue that emerges from having these you know, short projects which don't necessarily have continuity, and it'll just be this individual discrete project for a year or two. And then even if there's those gains over that short period of time, you know, doesn't, in the long term, that doesn't actually, you know, doesn't actually lead to those long-term conservation benefits. So I think that that's not something which we looked at, but I think that that is a really interesting thing to talk about. And I guess it links up to a lot of questions about relationship in conservation organizations and funders. And I think there's a lot to get into there.
Thanks, Tom. I think there's quite an interesting question here from Louise Swemmer, who asks about, well, she admits to joining late and apologizes. And then she asks about the trade-offs of using numbers, money, as the only indicator of cost. But in some cases, there are social costs which can't be quantified and may actually be more expensive.
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree. And I think this talks to that point about how decision science approaches, of which this could be considered, kind of fit into the wider process of decision making in conservation. I think that there's kind of a tendency, or it's quite attractive to have these really nice studies and these kind of models and stuff like that, especially if you're using kind of, I guess, these kind of spatial prioritization studies, and to just use that and that to be the end of the conversation. But I think that these should just be seen as tools which are used in this kind of wider process where you're actually consulting with effective groups, and there is this kind of dialogue. So I think that, you know, this issue around apples and oranges, comparing apples and oranges, and this issue around making sure that the societal costs and co-benefits are accounted for in decision-making process, that has to be through a dialogue, and that's something which I don't think could. I don't think such cost-effectiveness studies can actually take the place of that dialogue.
I wanted to ask you about the database of cost-effectiveness evidence. Is there something like that in existence, or are there plans afoot to develop something like that? Do you know anything about that?
So I don't know. So I've not actually spoken to the environmental evidence team about this, and I wouldn't want to kind of make any suggestions in that respect. I don't know if there are plans to develop such a database. I think that a kind of first step in doing that is actually to get conservation organizations or conservation scientists you have to have the kind of incentives in place for that type of data to actually be generated and kind of collected in this kind of rigorous way. And so, as I said before, the kind of first step to that has already been taken with the development of this standardized reporting tool. And I think you know, if that was more widely adopted, then there would be an obvious place for where such information could actually be stored in a database. But unfortunately, I don't know if that's happening. Maybe it is.
Because I quite liked the thing that you pointed out in the paper, and that is that would improve transparency and reporting of where the money goes that comes into conservation organizations, which might be quite an important thing to be transparent about.
Absolutely, and you know, another really cool area of research is there's Alison Catalano, who's doing her PhD at Imperial College London, and she's her PhD research was actually looking at how the conservation sector talks about and thinks about failure, so learning from failure basically, and how, you know, being transparent about where things have gone right and also where things have gone wrong is actually a kind of really necessary step for conservation to be able to actually move forwards in terms of improving effectiveness. But there's a lot of barriers there, again, coming back to the relationship between conservation organizations and funders. And I think there needs to be a bit of a kind of shift in that relationship.
Yeah, and that links with a comment that Claudia Schöner made in the chat, where she says that conservation organizations themselves might have an idea about the cost effectiveness of their various projects, information which they may or may not want to get published.
Yeah, and I mean, I suspect that is the case, particularly for larger conservation organizations. I'm sure that's the case. And I think, you know, to my mind, the thing there is understanding the concerns of conservation organizations, which I would think probably would be legitimate in terms of concerns about continuity of funding and stuff like that, and thinking about ways in which you can foster an environment and put tools out there that perhaps reduces those risks associated with transparently disclosing this information. So it could be something like this information is reported, but it's just reported anonymously. And obviously you might lose a little bit of kind of context around that, but that might be a kind of one way of overcoming this issue.
Yeah. I mean, linked to that is there's another comment from Louise that I'll read to you now. But I was intrigued by you saying that conservation campaigns may have the dual objectives of raising awareness of a given environmental issue and promoting an organization's brand, which may advance institutional objectives, even if not directly enhancing conservation impact. Do you have examples of that?
So I think that there's a very fine line between, and actually it's a very difficult thing to determine, you know, to what extent is a kind of given awareness raising campaign, for instance, something which is directly contributing to conservation or indirectly contributing to conservation because you're enhancing that institutional continuity and that institutional sustainability. So that's definitely not a that's a very fuzzy line, and I think that this again talks a little bit about talks back a little bit about that challenge of doing that attribution when you have these complex theories of change. So there might be this argument that says you're engaging in a awareness raising campaign which has quite a lot of branding in it as well, because it's enhancing the long-term sustainability of that institution, and then that's feeding back into conservation outcomes in the long term. But obviously that kind of attribution is these many steps along that chain. So you can imagine that being quite difficult.
Yeah, sorry for putting you on the spot there. Louise Femmer says, thanks, Thomas. I absolutely get the apples and oranges. An interesting paper by Jenny Buerta called Is Something Better Than Nothing? Dabbles in that a bit too. I don't know if you're aware of that or...
Yeah, well, so I think that's one which I did look at, but it's not coming to me off the top of my head. I don't know if, I mean, it'd be I mean, it'd be great, Louise, if you could expand on that. I'd love to hear kind of what you were thinking in that respect in relation to that paper.
Louise, you want to unmute and chat to Thomas?
Yeah, sure. Good evening. Sorry, I've got a bit of background noise. So the paper that Jenny wrote was about the medicinal plant nurseries that were started in the 90s, and she was looking at benefits versus costs and looked at tangible and intangible benefits, because the funders were kind of reporting on the money and showing the sort of benefits from the money and showing a net gain. But then in some instances, some of the costs like jealousies or animosities and things that were created around the businesses actually resulted in people feeling, well, they'd actually rather not have had the nursery to start with, even if you just looked at the money and the money showed that there were benefits. So it was just that sort of acknowledgement of those social components when you're looking at the bigger picture, and the trade-offs between the costs and benefits. And it's the soft and hard costs and benefits. Kind of hard to measure. So I'm just sort of reflecting on what you said. It's really hard to sort of measure, and people like to see the numbers.
Yeah, and I suppose that is always the danger, isn't it? That if you present those numbers, then it's easy to just stop there and not ask those deeper questions or those kind of more critical questions. So I suppose something like this, relates a bit to what we were kind of talking a moment ago about the kind of need for wider transparency and that kind of willingness to be able to recognize when things aren't necessarily going to plan and things haven't worked out in the way that's expected, and to be able to kind of talk about those in a productive way. So yeah, I mean, I completely agree.
Thanks. And then Louise also said in the chat that she agrees with what managers call learning lessons, funders often call mistakes.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that I know that there are funders who are looking at their practices in this respect, and who are being really, trying to be proactive to kind of change this dialogue. And I guess this is something which, it would be great if, it was adopted more widely. I mean, it's obviously always a balancing act, because, whilst it's necessary to learn from failure, you wouldn't want to continue to fund projects which aren't working, for instance. So there is inevitably going to be some kind of penalty there, I guess, and so that's likely to exist as a barrier, unless, as I say, you can kind of go back to this idea of perhaps anonymizing some of this information. So I think there's a difference between learning lessons about what's working and not working at an individual project or site level, and then learning about what's working and what's not working at a more, these are the kind of groups of or types of interventions that are being adopted. Do these types of interventions actually work or not work?
Cool. Okay, I seem to have run out of questions on the chat. Is there anybody who has another question for Tom? You're welcome to ask out loud.
If I may, this sort of getting funding is a continuous problem. So do you think that sort of society should be paying a general fee for conservation? Because I think with running one project after the other, you don't get any long-term approach, and humanity without biodiversity is a bit of a sad existence, in case we survive these vaccinations they're putting on us at the moment. Would you think that society, that there should be a different approach to generating money for conservation?
So, I mean, I think that, although in the talk that I said that there wasn't enough resources for conservationists to achieve their aims, I mean, it is also this question about, I mean, there is a lot of money which is invested in conservation, and there's a lot of money which is poorly invested in conservation. And so I think that, it is a matter of looking at, where money is being poorly spent, you know, where money is essentially being wasted. At the same time, yes, calling for governments and calling for other actors to increase their funding. But you know, I think that would become much easier if you can kind of clearly articulate what is that return on investment for those funds. And I suppose there's kind of a broader point that, you know, 2020 was a kind of a challenging year, I suppose, in that, you know, we had that kind of confirmation that the HE biodiversity targets weren't met, and there's a nice paper which was recently published in Oryx by my supervisor EJ Milner-Gulland, where she was basically talking about 2020 and the kind of things that didn't quite go right then. But at the same time, you know, you're looking at even over the last couple of months, there's actually been a lot of really positive changes at a more societal level. So I think that, you know, Biden, for instance, having this really a kind of a proactive, whilst there's still criticisms of the approach that he's taking, a kind of really ambitious approach towards conservation and tackling climate change. And I think that that's going to be helping to set the agenda. In the UK, there's been a substantial increase in funding to Nature England, for example. So, so I think that, yes, definitely we kind of need to continue thinking about ways of making the case to society for why biodiversity conservation is important. But I'm actually quite optimistic about the kind of plans to bend the curve on biodiversity loss over the next 10 years. Perhaps that's naive, but I kind of think that there's some of those really positive signals that are starting to come out.
Thank you. I don't, Louise, I've got a hand up. Louise? Sorry,
I've got another. Just on that last point, I think, you know, one of the ways we're going to do that is by including all the intangible stuff as well. So, you know, one way we will fail is if we try and quantify everything in terms of the value of biodiversity to society. So we've got to find ways of doing it. It's not easy. But then I also think in terms of quantifying, you know, not quantifying, but evaluating effectiveness. And I've struggled with it as a social scientist, evaluating effectiveness of programs. So who decides what is a success and what is a failure? I think Claudia was sort of alluding to that as well, and at what scale. So if you think of an employment program, for example, linked to a conservation agency, they employ some people to do a project, some sort of a, I don't know, like a rehab project or something for a certain number of years. And maybe the rehab failed, but, you know, 30 people were employed for 3 years and they got a salary. So does that mean that the project failed? So I think it's sort of far more nuanced than success or failure. And it's a challenge that we have as protected area managers, is to try and decide what you're actually reporting on. So I'm sure you touched on that sort of stuff in the beginning, but, you know, what are the objectives that we're evaluating success against?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's something which, you know, IP bears their approaches to now talking about the kind of plurality of values associated with human and non-human nature relations. And I think that we've kind of got to the point where, you know, there was that at times slightly acrimonious discussion 5 or 10 years ago. It was talking about how should you be talking about things in, you know, in terms of costs and monetary values, or should we be talking about things like intrinsic values and stuff like that? But I think a kind of a positive thing is that actually it's people are now recognizing that you need to talk about all of those things and many more different things, and that there are actually lots of different mediums for communicating that information. So, you know, there's a really good paper, and I can't remember the name of it, that was basically talking about the value of communicating through more like narrative stories, for instance. So that could be something which is also in the kind of context of a kind of a report which is sent back to funders, for example, is also communicating in more kind of narrative terms. There's a question there from Pete Goodman. Effectiveness can only be evaluated against your initial goals set for the intervention. So I think that it's like, I guess there's almost parallels here with pre-registering scientific reports. So there's value in terms of having your kind of predefined idea of what you think going in is the kind of outcomes that are important. But at the same time, you know, conservation is this kind of process of learning, and we don't necessarily know what's going to be the kind of positive outcomes. It needs, yeah. So, and I think that there basically needs to be scope for both. And I think that you can report on saying this is what we were expecting, and this is what were the outcomes in the context of our expectations. So that's, you know, that's the kind of standard log frame way in which you might think about reporting. But then at the same time saying these were the unexpected things that we, that kind of the unexpected benefits and the unexpected costs that came up. And perhaps these are the kind of things that we've learned from it.
Thank you. I've just posted the title of your paper, which can be accessed. It's open access in conservation science and practice. I've just put it in the chat there for you, Louise, and for anybody else. So I think we seem to have dried up in terms of questions and comments, Tom. So I would like to thank you for your time, the time that you spent preparing and sharing the details of your paper with us. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and as I said to you beforehand, I think it's a really important topic, and something that certainly deserves further attention. And then I would like to thank everybody who joined us. Tom, you'll be pleased to know that we had people attending from New Orleans, from Washington, D.C., from Hoedspruit next to Kruger, Germany, Cape Town, Brazil, the Eastern Cape. So fairly good representation, and kind of wide geographical spread. Then lastly, before we say goodbye, I would just like to remind everybody that we're having a bumper month in June in terms of these SCB emerging issues and conservation seminars. We have 5 Wednesdays in June, and we've got one scheduled for every single Wednesday. Next Wednesday at 8 GMT is Bernard Coetzee from the University of Pretoria. And Bernard will be covering a recent accepted paper of his entitled An Appeal for More Rigorous Use of Counterfactual Thinking in Biological Conservation. So please do join us. It is available on the links are available on the Conservation Science and Practice webpage, so you can register there. And then I look forward to seeing you again in our future seminars. Thank you very much. And goodbye. Thanks, Tom.